Sony has a track record of making truly great and impressively accurate TVs. I myself am a huge fan. As a reviewer, I have called more than one of their past displays a reference in my reviewer stable. This year, they finally came to market with two RGB mini LED TVs with the release of the Bravia 7 II and 9 II. Now, the 7 II we're reviewing today has been very well received by the press, and why shouldn't it? According to Sony, you're getting richer color, wider coverage of P3 and Rec 2020, greater color accuracy, and tighter control over both color and brightness, not to mention processing that allows for even more precise control over those RGB backlights. I'm just not seeing it. I want to preface this entire review by saying that the team at Sony put the 85-inch model you're seeing here through a proper check before sending it on its way. So I unboxed it, I sat through Google TV and Sony's terms of service twice for some reason, and discovered one of the dimmest out-of-the-box images I've seen in years. Now, to be fair, Sony has never really chased class-leading brightness. The standard picture profile, the mode selected by default, measured 580 nits out of the box. And that was on a windowed pattern where peak brightness usually measures higher than it does across the full screen. And the image rarely looked anywhere near that bright with actual content. But brightness wasn't the only surprise. Colors looked noticeably off, leaning towards the blue-green side of the spectrum. Now, I use CalMan in a professional light meter for all of my testing, and I measured a grayscale delta E of 9 and a color delta E of 6. That's roughly 2 to 3 times the generally accepted threshold of visible error. So what's going on? Some have said the Bravia 7 II is incredibly close to the more expensive Bravia 9 II. If that's the case, then I think Sony is in big trouble. And no, I don't believe my unit is defective, but I do wonder if the legacy that is Sony isn't doing some pretty heavy lifting when it comes to this TV. Now, I know that picture profiles like standard, vivid, and energy saving are rarely accurate, regardless of the manufacturer. And anyone familiar with Sony TVs knows the professional profile is typically pretty stellar and the place to start if you want the most accurate factory image. So after seeing the dim results in standard, that's what I selected, and I could have sworn the TV had switched itself off. Peak light output in professional mode measured 74 nits. Yes, you heard that right. I said 74 nits. And no, there was nothing wrong with the TV or my equipment. And I also ran this 74 nit figure past one of Sony's representatives, and they said I was within range. Setting aside the brightness figures, the usually spot-on professional profile wasn't particularly accurate either. I measured a grayscale delta E of 4.8 and a color delta E of 3.7. Those errors, now they may not immediately jump out under casual viewing conditions, but neither result qualifies as calibrated. And for a brand that has historically been among the best when it comes to factory accuracy, numbers like these are surprising. Thankfully, HDR10 and Dolby Vision were both brighter, with the factory HDR10 profiles ranging from 1500 to 1650 nits, and Dolby Vision Bright measured a little over 1800 nits with factory settings, but neither was accurate. HDR10's grayscale and color accuracy remained outside reference levels, with grayscale ranging from 6 at best to 26 at worst. Dolby Vision Bright grayscale and color had a delta E figure of 7 and 8. This means that none of the factory profiles I measured delivered a truly accurate image without needing further adjustment or professional calibration. So let's talk about calibration, because this is where the Bravia 7 II hides one of its biggest and most confounding changes. Sony has removed the TV's CMS, the controls calibrators use to fine-tune color accuracy. Why? According to an on-the-record conversation I had with Sony, its factory tuning is so precise that a simple grayscale calibration is all that's needed for everything else to fall into line. That's a pretty bold claim, one my measurements just don't support. I calibrated the TV as fully as Sony allows and improved grayscale accuracy to near reference levels with delta E figures around 1 or lower. But the color accuracy barely moved. In professional mode, color delta E improved from 3.7 to 3.6. Dolby Vision Dark was the lone exception. improving from 3.5 to 2.3, the best overall result I achieved. But across the TV's other profiles, correcting grayscale did little to correct color. Without a CMS, there is simply nowhere for this TV to go. And the missing CMS may not be the strangest part. Although the Bravia 7 II uses an RGB Mini LED backlight, it doesn't always operate in full RGB mode. Depending on the local dimming setting and the content on screen, Sony can either drive the red, green, and blue LEDs independently for greater color volume or combine them to produce white light. And the only place Sony lets you choose directly between the two approaches is in the professional profile. But here's the catch. Despite having two different backlight modes available to you in the professional profile, Rec 2020 coverage wasn't as good as I've seen from competing RGB displays. The best I measured was 89%, though depending on the settings, it could drop as low as 80% coverage. P3 coverage was more stable on the Sony at 97 to 99%, depending on the profile settings. So one of this TV's bigger selling points, the ability to change its backlighting from white to RGB, isn't being used as successfully. By comparison, the Hisense UR8 we just reviewed managed about 95% coverage on the much larger Rec 2020 color space and 100% of P3. But to be clear, the difference between Sony's 80% and Hisense's 95% Rec 2020 coverage isn't enough for me to completely write off the Bravia 7 II, especially if Sony's unconventional backlight strategy results in less of the color crosstalk RGB Mini LED is already earning a reputation for. Unfortunately, the Bravia has visible color shifting issues of its own, and they become jarringly obvious the brighter you make the image. While watching The Dark Knight, seen here in 4K cinematic playing on the Strato K, a format arguably closer in quality to the original source material than even physical disc, you can see that when the TV's brightness was at its maximum and peak luminance and local dimming were set to medium or high, specular highlights in reflections and especially on skin shift from reddish pink to green or yellow during movement and camera pans. It was clearly visible to the naked eye and obvious enough that even Christie noticed it too. Once the movement stopped and the actors or cameras settled down, the colors returned to normal and, to Sony's credit, often looked excellent. Nevertheless, the shifting was persistent. I also noticed it on the recent release of Supergirl, again in 4K cinematic. To minimize the issue, I had to calibrate the TV and turn most of its light output settings and enhancements down or off. The result, frankly, was incredibly dark. The settings needed to reduce the artifact resulted in an HDR peak output of roughly 1500 nits, while full screen brightness reached around 700 nits. So yes, you can avoid the Bravia's color contamination, but you'll have to give up much of the brightness RGB Mini LED is supposed to deliver. And I can already hear some of you saying, Andrew, 700 or 1500 nits is more than enough for most SDR and HDR content. On paper, you're right. Under ideal conditions, inside a post-production color bay or a completely light-controlled home theater, those figures should be more than enough. But on this TV, those headline numbers do not translate into a sufficiently legible image during darker scenes. Even with the lights off and our shades drawn, large portions of both films' darker scenes were visually useless unless I raised the Bravia's peak brightness enough to make the action legible, at which point color shifting, backlight ramping, or both became a problem. In a completely light-controlled environment, one could argue that the Sony has impressive black level rendering. The 7 II is capable of hitting OLED level benchmarks for black, specifically 0.0 nits. But even in moderate ambient lighting, no combination of picture settings work to bring detail out of those deep, rich blacks, and none could overcome this TV's other Achilles heel, reflections, turning what should be a pro into a pretty big con. The Bravia 7 II has a highly reflective screen, both on and off axis. From the side, it behaves almost like a mirror. But even dim light sources near the center of the screen produced reflections distracting enough that no amount of brightness adjustment, not even switching to vivid mode, could overcome them. Overhead lighting fared best, but for large portions of the day, watching YouTube or even news broadcasts meant accepting the visual equivalent of, what did they say? And unfortunately, I'm not finished. Off-axis, the Bravia 7 II's color and contrast shift noticeably, making it look more like an older generation LED TV than one with state-of-the-art backlighting. To Sony's credit, edge-to-edge uniformity is very good, excellent even. But it's difficult to appreciate when you're constantly fighting the display's reflections and limited usable light output. Under ideal conditions and with strict control over ambient light, the Bravia 7 II can produce an image that looks mostly accurate, if slightly oversaturated in some colors, particularly red, and I'm not surprised that some viewers enjoy it. Even I enjoyed the Sony from time to time. Brightly lit comedies like The Devil Wears Prada 2 looked great on the Bravia, as did 4K demo videos and real estate walkthroughs from one of my favorite YouTube channels, The Local Project. But excelling with content like this doesn't make it a good or great TV. To put it in F1 terms, it makes this TV a midfield contender, and Sony isn't known for running in the midfield. And all that talk of Sony's superior processing starts to fall apart when you consider the premium being charged for performance that is measurably worse in several meaningful categories than TVs costing less. Yes, Sony's XR processor retains fine detail and upscales legacy content with the best of them, and can even control the limited backlighting well enough to suppress things like blooming in a way that looks impressive. But those advantages are most apparent under tightly controlled conditions that don't reflect real life, or where a TV this large is probably gonna live. So if you watch content with subtitles, I hope you're watching inside a black hole, because otherwise, you're gonna have trouble seeing through the reflections. I am genuinely at a loss here. I've really had to park my own opinions and biases because I am a massive Sony fan. But this TV has me confused. The Hisense UR8 and even the non-RGB TCL QM7L and QM8L outperform the more expensive Bravia 7 II in far too many meaningful ways. We recently reviewed the 100-inch Hisense UR8, and under the same test conditions, it delivered demonstrably better measurements and a superior overall viewing experience than the Bravia 7 II. And when you consider that the 100-inch Hisense can be found for roughly the same price as the 85-inch Sony reviewed here, this is no longer just a Sony tax. But even more surprising is that TCL's SQD MiniLED TVs, the QM7L and QM8L, also outperform the Sony in nearly every category, with the possible exceptions of viewing angle, edge-to-edge uniformity, and in the case of the QM7L, fast motion. Barely. I wouldn't call the 7 II a gaming or motion powerhouse. At the time of recording, the 85-inch QM7L saves you roughly $1,500, while the QM8L still saves you around $700. So I'm left asking the same question. What exactly are you getting by choosing the Bravia 7 II? The only answer I can come up with is that you're buying the Sony name, and I believe that name is doing much of the work behind the Bravia 7 II's glowing reviews and buy now recommendations. Because if this TV had a TCL, Hisense, or hell, even an LG badge on the front, everything I've just described, on a panel with only 2 HDMI inputs supporting 4K 120, one of which doubles as EARC, and gaming performance that tops out at 120 Hz, would cause a riot in the comments. In poring over the coverage of this TV, especially knowing my review would be viewed as critical, I repeatedly found measurements and observations that did not support the overwhelmingly positive conclusions. Some reviews acknowledged missing CMS, color crosstalk, reflections, limited viewing angles, and less expensive competition, and still went on to recommend the Bravia anyway. And I don't get it. We don't get better products by trading on nostalgia or reputation. We get better products by holding poor performance accountable. So that's what I'm doing.